Welcome once again to INSEAD Knowledge. Today we have with us again Dr. Renato Orsado from the INSEAD Social Innovation Center. And also we have Josh Steineman, Vice President of Global Development for Better Place USA. Your company is called Better Place, and you have a very ambitious goal of making the world a better place by 2020 by eliminating our addiction to oil. How are you going to go about doing that?
I think it's important to set the context, which is there is a growing awareness and acceptance that our current transportation model is not sustainable, and there's a high level of urgency to actually start to transition to something that is sustainable. At Better Place, we looked across a spectrum of alternatives to fueling our personal transportation fleet with hydrocarbons, and we came to the conclusion that electric really is the shortest term, most viable alternative. So Better Place was created to effectively accelerate the transition from petrol, oil-based transportation to electric drive. And we do it with an innovative business model with technology and infrastructure and developing a global supply chain ecosystem that brings to bear all the various players that are required to really provide a competitive alternative to the conventional internal combustion engine vehicle.
So there is a technical solution involved, but there's also a business model involved.
The business model is actually quite straightforward. Today, a person goes to the oil company, a petrol station, and purchases, let's say, their next week of driving from the oil company. They fill up their tank, and the next 300 or 400 miles is paid for. And then they drive that and then they pay for the next 400 miles. In the case of Better Place, what we're saying to the customer is, for a similar amount that you're paying the oil companies for your next 400 miles of driving, we would charge you a similar amount, in some cases less depending on the local market conditions, and we will provide you the next 400 miles of mobility. But our miles are based on clean electrons.
And it's less expensive than...
So the business model is actually, the way that Better Place makes money is that there's actually a difference in our cost to provide someone 1 mile on electric and the cost that the price they're paying for 1 mile on say oil or petrol-based mobility. That difference is good enough today to actually create a viable business. And that's the premise that we're going forward and launching in Israel and Denmark as soon here as 2011. So that difference is actually, to distill it all down to the simplest form, is the difference between providing 1 mile of mobility on electric versus 1 mile of mobility on oil. We provide a subscription for mobility. And it's very, very similar. On a contract basis, the customer may decide to subscribe for 1 year, for 2 years, for 3 years, for a certain number of miles. And it's very similar to the discussion you might have with a leasing agent when you lease your vehicle. How many miles do you drive? How many miles would you like to buy? So on a monthly basis, we collect a subscription fee. And in exchange for that, that customer has use of a Better Place battery pack, which is a very expensive asset, access to all the charging infrastructure that we've already deployed. We provide all the electrons, the energy required to drive those number of miles, and a host of services in-car and out-of-car to support the use of the vehicle in a way that is optimized and as convenient as possible. And in our market research, some of the reaction is that the use of the electric vehicle in our model is more convenient and more desirable than the conventional vehicle that we see today.
Maybe what Better Place represents is a recombination of technologies with a new value proposition, a new business model. And I think is a great example of how new enterprises can overcome the old barriers to the electrification of mobility, if you can call that. So I think Better Place, in the way that I portray in my own book, is a sustainable value innovation, mainly because it creates a new value for customers at lower environmental impact and lower cost, but also in general generates by reducing the dependence of oil, of society from oil. You create a great value for society as a whole.
And tell me about the projects, the implementations that you have going on in Israel and Denmark.
Israel is a tremendously exciting deployment we have underway. There's a couple of things happening in Israel. So our company's headquartered in Palo Alto, California, which is just south of San Francisco, but we also have our majority of our R&D taking place actually outside of Tel Aviv in Israel. So from a design and development perspective, there's a lot of resources there that are doing the development for the hardware and the software of our solution. In parallel, we also have the first deployment of Better Place services underway in Israel. So today, if you were to go visit Tel Aviv or Jerusalem, there's about 800 charge points that have been deployed that you can pull up in your electric car, you can plug in, and they're for demonstration and testing and validation purposes. So our R&D teams, as they're designing software, as they're developing hardware, are able to validate assumptions and test these systems in a live environment. Now, Israel is on a track to actually launch commercial services, commercial Better Place services with commercial vehicles in mid-2011 with several 100,000 charge points, number of battery swap stations, and full commercial services for various customer segments. So they will be the first, along our timeline, the first electric vehicle operation to be launched in the world. And Israel really will serve as a showcase for what's possible in both their end and in any other country in the world.
And Renault Nissan is providing the vehicles?
Renault Nissan are providing the vehicles. Carlos Ghosn has been a fantastic supporter of ours, and he actually made the trip down to Israel back in January of 2008 to announce this venture with Shai and with the political leadership of Israel. And Renault is committed to supplying the electric vehicles for this market launch in 2011.
And then following that, I suppose you have a global business model in mind. How would it develop? The
global business model really is tremendously important. Doing one market like Israel is a great showpiece, but how do you really make an impact on reducing oil consumption, on CO2 abatement, on resolving issues of energy security? You really have got to design this in a way that's repeatable, in a way that's quickly replicable in other markets. So we've actually announced our intentions to deploy services in 5 other markets. And the other market that will launch in 2011 is Denmark. And Denmark is, in many ways, another very, very attractive country, in that it's a small country. So from the perspective of building out the infrastructure to provide complete coverage across the nation, it's quite a bounded sort of project. Denmark has already implemented, before even Better Place arrived there, a tax policy which is extremely advantageous for EVs. They tax vehicles at a very, very high rate, up to 180% for conventional vehicles, and they've applied a 0% tax rate on EVs until the end of 2012. So there was a massive incentive for companies like Better Place to begin doing work on electric vehicles in Denmark as a result of this policy. So in 2011, you'll see 2 markets from Better Place and with Renault vehicles, and that is Israel and Denmark.
And what about larger countries?
In 2012, we've announced our intention to launch services in 4 other markets. Those markets, in no particular order, include Australia, and we've talked about doing a lot of work along the eastern seaboard there during a phase 1. The islands of Hawaii. Governor Lingle and the Department of Energy have been tremendous supporters there, and as Hawaii Electric Company, the utility, and Hawaii is a perfect showcase for how to really, what they call paradise over there, and keep it paradise by taking the tailpipes off the road and converting to a complete sustainable all-electric solution. We'll be launching in 2012 in the Bay Area, and the mayors of San Francisco, Oakland, San Jose, and Governor Schwarzenegger's office have been incredibly supportive, and they were part of our announcement there earlier in 4th quarter of last year. And finally, the last market in North America is the province of Ontario in Canada. An absolutely critical market for car manufacturing. Canadians are very, very concerned about climate change and about energy security, and I think they have been very, very vocal about their support to begin sooner than later the transition toward green transportation.
I think it's important to understand that we have a moment here in which the production of electricity, which in itself is a problem, we have lots of emissions from there, and the use of electricity for mobility can come together and solve, eventually in the long run, together they solve a very large problem. between the production of electricity and the mobility, the oil that is used for mobility, you have around 75% of CO2 emissions. If you eventually tackle this problem together, which is more or less that we can see with the electrification of individual mobility, you eventually are going towards the elimination of the larger problem in terms of CO2 emissions.
Our commitment is to only purchase renewable energy, green electricity. So when there's a lot of debate in the public about is it more efficient to power EVs from coal plants versus actually burning petrol or diesel on an internal combustion engine. And whichever side of the debate, we actually don't want to go down that path. We've just said all of the electricity we purchase will be renewable. And in most of the markets, there's a sufficient supply of renewable energy, or there will be coming online, that we can structure power purchase agreements with utilities or energy providers such that at the end of any given year, however much electricity we've purchased, we can make sure that we account for that much incrementally added to the grid. And that's actually, we're a clean tech company, and virtually everyone at the company has got a pretty big green streak up their back. And this is a very, very important point that fossil fuel hydrocarbons are not being burned to power the electric cars. We need to be sustainable, and sustainable means wind, it means solar, it could even be nuclear in some markets, but non-thermal sources, if we want to simplify it, no smoke out of the smokestack.
So it's an end-to-end solution.
Think about it this way. In Denmark, they've got these wind farms offshore, and there are these wind farms, typically these wind turbines are 2-megawatt wind turbines. One of those wind turbines generates enough electricity for 3,000 vehicles driving 45 kilometers every single day of the year. So people talk about, wow, all these extra generation has to be put in place. It's actually not that much. Now, another way to think about it is that renewable energy generation is by nature intermittent. You look at a chart of wind production from any wind farm over a given month. The average looks not too bad, but if you actually look at the individual production on an hour-by-hour basis, it's massively chaotic. It's up, down, it's up, down, it's up, down. If you have somehow the ability to match the supply coming off these renewable energy assets, which is intermittent, with an intermittent demand, and our customers actually have a tremendous tolerance for latency, because you're not doing on-demand charging, you're providing enough charging to give them all the mobility that they need for any given day of driving. So we're able, in the way we've constructed the system, because we control when the cars charge or don't charge, working through utility interfaces, we're able to match over time quite carefully the output of renewable energy assets with the charging of the vehicles. That's part of the vision. And of course, there's a lot of work to do with the utilities to implement all this and the grid operators. But that's one of the things of value that we think we bring tremendously to the utilities that we're partnering with, is the ability to provide this intermittent demand. And it's in another context, it's actually called demand response. But in most markets, demand response is typically 24, 48 hours. Don't run your factory tomorrow or turn off half your lights tomorrow. Our demand response is measured in order of seconds for us to instruct X number of vehicles to stop charging or to start charging if the wind starts blowing more or the sun is shining and your assets are more productive.
How do you provide the electricity to your customers?
Yeah, there's a couple of ways that we provide energy to our subscribers. So again, they're subscribing to a certain number of kilometers or miles on a monthly or annual basis. And what they're getting from Better Place is the use of our battery pack, access to our charging infrastructure, the electricity that's required to drive those number of miles. Now, how do we actually provide that energy? The vast majority of the energy we provide is actually through charge points where the car is parked at night and they're plugged in. So Better Place's task during the initial stages of development is actually to deploy the charging infrastructure, which mostly consists of these trickle charge points. So you'll see them on our website. They're little charge points, 3-4 kilowatt lines that trickle charge the battery. So if you have a battery that's at 0%, it's 6, 7, 8 hours to get all the way up to a full charge.
Do you install the charge points in people's houses?
So there's a mixed design. If you just live in a single family dwelling, it's a little bit like the cable model. So you would go down and say, okay, I want to be a Better Place customer, and like sign up for cable television or satellite television, a truck would roll up and install a Better Place charge point, hook up with the electrical service, and then you have a place now to plug in your vehicle. If you live in an apartment building, you probably came in to be a Better Place customer because 6 months ago, 12 months ago, we already struck a deal with your landlord to electrify every charge point in the 2 or 3 or 4 levels underground parking in your apartment building. If you live in a city and you find on-street parking, you may think EVs is a compelling option because your municipality or the area or the borough that you live in, we've already worked with them to deploy charge points along the curb. So we have a plan. The thought is always put enough infrastructure in place ahead of the availability of the vehicles such that it's a compelling, obvious solution alternative to the conventional vehicles. So in all of our network designs, for example, in Israel and Denmark, in 2010, tens and tens of thousands of charge points are going into the ground leading up to a 2011 launch. And this is absolutely critical to overbuild the market initially to provide people that sense that no matter where they drive and park, at work, at home, shopping centers, movie theaters, coffee shops, they can plug in. Now, again, with the charging control we talked about, it doesn't mean when they're plugged in they're always charging, because sometimes they don't need to charge. We try to put as much charging to take place during the off-peak hours from midnight to 6 a.m., say. But there's always the ability to provide charge if they need it to meet their mobility needs. Our contract customer is unlimited mobility. And that's what they have today, and that's what we need to provide them tomorrow.
But what is the range of a charge?
So the first generation of vehicles that we are seeing coming to the market is about a 100-mile range, 160 kilometers. A little bit less if you drive with the windows down, the AC blasting, a little bit more if it's cold outside and you're running along the highway. But it's around a 100-mile range. Now, you look at statistics that say, what's the average drive? And even in the U.S., where people drive further distances, the average drive is still 40 miles or less for much more than 90% of your daily trips. So you talk about a 100-mile pack. What that means is that most of your driving, at the end of every day, if you didn't get any charging during the day, you still come home and you're more than half full. And you think about it, every single morning you wake up, come out to your car, you turn on the vehicle, and you have a full tank. In your conventional vehicle and your natural gas vehicle, every day it's a little bit less full until the end of the week it's time to go back to the gas station for your next week of driving. In our model, you're full every single morning when you leave the house.
What about for longer trips on weekends? You take your family out for a long drive on the weekend and
right,
more than 100 miles.
More than 100 miles. So the industry is looking at a variety of ways of providing what they basically call range extension. And I'll explain how Better Place's perspective on this. When you're doing 95% of your trips, which are the 40 or 50 miles or less per day, our perspective is, why carry around with you 400 miles of range that you only use once or twice a year or once a month? Put the range extension in the infrastructure. So provide a convenient, fast solution for people to drive the next 100 miles without burdening the vehicle for every mile it drives for every trip of every single day with the cost and complexity of having that range extension on board. So our solution to this is battery exchange. So the battery exchange looks effectively, from a footprint perspective, similar to like a car wash. You would pull in, and fully automated, it goes down a track, and a mechanical arm comes up underneath the vehicle. It extracts the battery that's down to 15, 20%, and plugs in a fully charged pack that was charged last night with renewable energy. And off you go in just a couple of minutes. We've just recently demonstrated this technology actually in Japan, and this is going to be part of the network that we're rolling out in Israel and Denmark over the next couple of years.
But still, there's the attitude that people have towards new technologies, accepting new technologies. I wonder how companies like Better Place can overcome that type of a challenge.
The perception of driving an electric car, I could ask a question back. You know, have you ever driven an electric car? Yeah. Because if you have, I actually drove the EV1 back in '97 in California. I drove the Norwegian thing here in Europe. In the experience, I tell you, if you ever drove an electric car, you possibly don't want to go back to internal combustion engine car. The interesting thing here about the business model of Better Place is that they found a solution for the main problem of having or making electric vehicles commercially viable, which is detaching the battery pack from the car ownership and eventually, you know, bringing it to the infrastructure. So I think the issue of consumer behavior is a misconceived issue, because the car industry has said over and again that they make the cars that consumers want. But maybe it's a compromise of what the car industry actually can offer and what we really want. Because if you ever had an experience of driving an electric car, maybe you don't want to go back to the old technologies.
The question about consumer education is a very important one, because certainly you could have the best technology in the world. If the customers don't understand how they're going to use it, how to interact with it, of course that's convenient and simple, you're going to have a lot of barriers to entry. So the approach is twofold for us from a sort of a customer adoption perspective. I've already mentioned one, which is you need to build out that infrastructure before the cars arrive. So your target segments, the fleet operators or the general consumers, in 6 months, 9 months, 12 months, before those EVs are available in the showroom, they're seeing those little charge points popping up all over the place. They're getting to the point that they can't pull into a parking lot without seeing 1 or 2 or 3 or 5 of those charge points sitting there ready to go. That's the first piece of it, deploying the infrastructure and building that customer confidence that wherever they drive, wherever they park, they can plug in and get a charge. The second piece, which we're doing in Israel right now, is actually building out a visitor demonstration center. So if you can get a customer or a potential customer, a consumer, to come in and sit through some videos to understand how the system works, explain the user interface that sits in the car that informs about route navigation and planning that we provide, about the geolocation of each of the charge points. And they'll say, okay, this is my destination, and it says, okay, here are the places you can park and plug in. They're idle and free right now. Here are the battery exchange stations along your long drive route, and so here are the 2 swaps you have to make on your way. Providing all that support, and then in a visitor center, a year or 2 years before the cars are even available, they can go down, the whole family, and they can sit through some multimedia presentations, understand exactly how to set it. So, okay, this is very simple, this is easy to use, it's one touch, it's not complicated. And then they go around the back and they get into an actual electric vehicle, and we have a number that we've converted, and they drive around a track. They plug the vehicle in to see how easy it is and how simple. They pull into a battery swap station, see what this swap mechanism looks like. They'll walk out of there after an hour or 90-minute program, and they'll be sold. And then the question is, how do I sign up and get into the queue? And as Renato has said, if you drive an EV, it's pretty hard to come away from that experience not saying, wow, this is pretty cool. You know, how do I get one? I think a lot of us have this feeling like, if I didn't have to have a tailpipe, if I didn't have to pollute to get to work every day, you know, that would be a pretty good thing. Now, provide someone the solution that's economical, that's convenient, and that's really a true alternative to the internal combustion engine, and we'll have something. And that's what we're going to be demonstrating next year in Israel and in Denmark, and we'll be launching in 2011 in those 2 markets.
Well, thank you, Josh, for joining us on INSEAD Knowledge, and thank you once again, Renato.